Hello and welcome back to Protect Life, here breaking the consensus. I'd like to thank you for joining us again. Before we get going, I'd like to point out there's the subscribe button there and the like button. If you click on that, then that means anything new that comes up, you'll be advised of it. Secondly, as you know, we have a lot of campaigns we have to fight even in the midst of this pandemic, and our opportunities to get out amongst you are not what they would normally be. So if you can help us in those campaigns, we greatly appreciate it. The donate button is there. Whatever you can give, we can promise be used carefully and well to support those causes of life those values that we all share. So today I am joined again by Samuel Baker. Hello, thanks for joining us, Samuel. And we're going to be talking about the work that you're involved with in Walsingham, and just maybe a little bit. We'll be talking about Walsingham today and maybe a little bit about the history in the past. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be back. Absolutely delighted.
So before we get to what the work you're doing, I think a lot of people who are listening will have heard of the shrine at Walsingham, but maybe won't know much about it, of the history, of the nature, of the context of it in the past, and then its revival in the 19th century. So maybe if you could give us a sense of Walsingham and its role and its importance historically in the English church.
Yeah, and it does go back quite some centuries. I think even as a sort of holy place, I think there's remains of a Roman shrine to Mercury, who intriguingly Mercury was the messenger of Jupiter. And you'll see later the connections with the angel Gabriel and the Annunciation. So there seems to be quite an intriguing link there. So there have been remains found of a Roman shrine to Mercury. So Walsingham as a place, it has this kind of heritage of being somewhere holy. It was also quite an important political base. If you remember at the time. So this is in the 11th century. 1061, in fact, was the miraculous happening, which we can get to later, that established it as a Christian Catholic shrine. And England then was sort of being torn into pieces by the Danes, the Anglo-Saxons, and then only a few years later, the Normans would come in. So I don't know, I guess pretty much the same was happening in Ireland. I guess that Christianity was establishing itself, but it was having to fight back the raiding hordes of Danes or whoever was coming in at the time. So there was some upheaval, but Walsingham was just outside the Danish borders in East Anglia. If people don't know geographically, it's on the very eastern coast of England, Norfolk way, 10 minutes from the sea. So it was a very important political stronghold. And a trading stronghold as well, that being a port, trade would come in across the sea, and then would go from Walsingham across into the mainland down towards London and the like. And so at the time, it was a manor house. It had farmlands, and the lord and lady of the manor at the time, and the king was Edward the Confessor in the 1060s, was the brother-in-law. Sorry, the brother-in-law of Edward the Confessor. So his wife's brother, Harold, who later became the Harold who was killed at the Battle of Hastings in the Norman invasion only a few years later. Mm-hmm. So there's a sort of strong historical background to it. When the miracle took place, the lady involved was a lady called Rocheldis or Reichhold, and we get a lot of this detail from, and interrupt me because I could go on about this history forever, from later on in the 1490s, when the printing press had been invented. We get something called the Pinson Ballad. Richard Pinson was the printer, the royal printer of the time, and his big claim to fame prior to this was printing Henry VIII's defense of the faith against Luther, that then from which he acquired the title Defender of the Faith. So Richard Pinson was quite a big name in the time of the printing press. Anyway, he prints this ballad about the miracle at Walsingham, and that's where we get a lot of our detail. Okay, 400 years later, but the detail has been sort of verified as accurate as possible. This detail, where he talks of this Reichel, this lady, who receives this vision from Our Lady. It says, I'm just going to bring it here because I can't sort of remember everything off the top of my head. But this lady was a noble widow living in this town of Walsingham, and she wished to honour Our Lady with some particular work, and was, as it's put, led by the Spirit. So potentially she had a dream or whatever, by Our Lady to Nazareth, to see the place where Gabriel, and so here we have this link with the messenger, where Gabriel greeted Our Lady, and Our Lady asked that a replica of this house be built in Walsingham, and says via this ballad, so that all shall seek me there, all that seek me there shall find succor, and where shall be had in a memorial the great joy of my salutation, the Annunciation. So there we go. There's a sort of potted history to the background of it. Of course, this house, this replica, is then built. And around that, over the centuries, arises this great basilica, this abbey, and the whole town of Walsingham, or village of Walsingham, becomes a town, and becomes, I think, if I remember rightly, the third biggest pilgrimage destination in Europe, after Rome and Santiago de Compostela, the fourth in Christendom after Jerusalem, and the only shrine at the time specifically dedicated to Our Lady.
So this is where the Holy House, which is, people will have heard references to the Holy House of Walsingham. Originally, the idea was that this lady was, in the language of the time, vouchsafed a vision, and directed to build a house of the style of the House of Nazareth, and that was which became the locus of the pilgrimage. I associate it with also a statue, a medieval statue of Our Lady and the Christ Child, a wooden carving. Is that from this period as well, or am I?
Yes. So I can't give an exact date on that one off the top of my head.
That is Walsingham, isn't it?
It is, yes. Sort of the seat of wisdom, and it's very symbolic as well. There are 7 rings on the statue, 3 on one side of the throne, 4 on the other. She's carrying the root of Jesse, which is flowering into a lily, and the Christ child, is sitting on her lap. And there are various sort of replica of it, and I think I need to remember correctly what happened to it at the dissolution of the monasteries. I think that the original one disappeared, and then was found later on, perhaps not too many decades ago, possibly. It was found in London, if I remember rightly. So I'm a little bit hazy on what happened to that statue, but it is now very representative.
It's interesting, isn't it, that of the great pilgrimage sites, as you said, there was the site to St. James in Compostela, Rome, obviously, Jerusalem, obviously, but then Walsingham, that it should be that it's England should have a Marian shrine, particularly. There was a great pilgrimage to Canterbury as well, later on, particularly to the tomb of Thomas Becket. But I don't expect you to know this, but I think it's curious. I know that in the medieval period, many countries had different sobriquets, and one of the sobriquets of England was that England was called the Dowry of Mary, and that the English were known and noted for the particular devotion that the English Catholics had to Our Lady, and I think that was associated again with Walsingham.
That's right, and I mean, one of the things that made this association so particular and so great was that when Richeldis, this noble lady, tried to build the replica of the house, she couldn't. There were all sorts of difficulties with it. The measurements weren't correct, and things just weren't going up properly. She, as far as I remember the story, remained in prayer all night, and the next morning the house had been miraculously built, And I've had a story tell of when she was shown where the house should be built. I've heard this one anecdotally. In the morning, in the dew on this field, there were two dry patches, and she chose one particular patch to build the house on. But the next day, after it hadn't been built, and there were all these problems, it was then built on the other dry patch. It was built near a couple of wells as well, and these wells had healing properties. People were healed. Now, because the house appeared miraculously, and this was from Nazareth, this was the house where the Annunciation took place. So we assume, therefore, that it's Mary's parents' house, not the house that then Joseph takes her to after. These associations then gave Walsingham the name of England's Nazareth. And this Pinson ballad ends, it says here, I've just got some notes in front of me, ends rejoicing that England can be compared to the land of promise, Zion, the Holy Land. It is Our Lady's dowry. Dowry meaning not so much what the wife's family gave to the husband at all. It wasn't so much that, but the dowry was what the wife took with her to her marriage, that she had something to live off. It was what she took her own personal wealth from. And I think that's sort of, once you understand that, it kind of changes a little bit the notion, and you talk about England being Mary's dowry, of what England should be. It should be that place that Mary uses as her own. And I think we've lost sight of that, the English people anyway, of what that actually ought to mean for us as a people, and what we ought to be doing for England and for Walsingham, so that it becomes fit for Mary's dowry, for her to use as her own. And I think there's a lot of work for us as English Catholics to do, to understand that, and to see the impact that it could have on our country.
So it's a very important site. Very important people go. Many monarchs go there. We know Henry VIII made pilgrimage to there. Catherine of Aragon did. Anne Boleyn also made pilgrimage to the site of the apparition. However, in 1533 to 1534, you have the dissolution of the monasteries, and then the dissolution of the minor monasteries. There had been a priory, a very large priory built there at Walsingham, which was dissolved. I think the sub-prior was hanged because he was accused of being involved in anti-state activities in opposition to the dissolution of the minor priories. So what happens at this moment? What happens to Walsingham after the dissolution?
Well, it's interesting that there is one big archway of the Abbey left, and we call it the Abbey grounds, but it's now in private hands. It's a private landowner, but they open the gates up, and we can go in, and we can take processions in. We can have liturgies and masses there, and it's just this huge single archway left, standing on its own in a big meadow, and that's all that's left. Well, I say that's all. There are a couple of walls of the dining hall, I think. There's also something that looks like a cellar, or was a cellar, and then just a stone where the Holy House was as part of this. So those grounds are still there. So you do get quite an eerie sense of what it could have been like. And there are maps of the time, and you can kind of trace out the footings of this abbey. And it was huge. I mean, Walsingham now, and I'm sitting just in my room up in the village, and it's a tiny, tiny village. But the size of the abbey, and just down the road are the remains of the friary as well, which was built a little bit later. Two enormous liturgical buildings for what's now a tiny, tiny village. Talking about the prior, opposite the abbey grounds is a building that the Catholic Church owned, the Catholic Shrine owns. We call it now Dowry House. And anecdotally, down in the cellar, and I've been down in the cellar, that's where the prior and I think a layman were held and quite possibly tortured. So it's a bit spooky when you go down into the cellar, before they were taken out into Friday Market, I think it was, or the marketplace. Friday Market is the market square outside where the shrine headquarters are. Yeah, and then they were hanged. But I think it was more, as you say, it was more kind of it was a kind of temporal rebellion. I don't think he was hanged as a martyr per se. I think he didn't like the fact that money was being taken from the shrine or from the abbey. I don't think he was martyred for his faith particularly, but for the fact that he didn't like the fact he was going to lose an income.
It struck me over the years that it's curious the way that the use of a word or a phrase, it can be so useful in framing the way we think about something. The dissolution of the monarchy, of the monasteries. It sounds like you put something into water, it just dissolves and it goes away. When actually, when you reflect on what happened, it's the single greatest act of iconoclasm and the destruction of art, architecture, this incredible wealth built up over 1,000 years of religious art and artifacts that happens in this very brief period of time. I mean, you referred to the location of Walsingham. It's in that part of England which was the source of wealth for England for many hundreds of years because of wool. It was the great wool centre. The city of Norwich there, I seem to remember reading once, in the 15th century, it had 55 medieval churches, which was more than any other city in Europe north of the Alps. England had this incredible wealth of these great monasteries, these great priories, great churches. And then they're destroyed. It happened here as well, but in a sense, it was done to us by foreigners, you know. And there wasn't. But I've often thought it must be curious for English Catholics. You're living in this space full of ghosts, full of things that should be still there. That when you go to Spain or you go to Italy and you see these great monasteries, these great abbatia from the 14th century, we had those too, but ours are gone. Tremendous sadness to that, but as well as the incredible act of barbarian destruction.
Yeah, and what that must have done to society. I mean, yeah, we're all getting upset that we have to stay in lockdown for a year and wear masks. And I keep thinking back to the time of the Reformation when literally a deeply embedded part of society was obliterated. And if you think about the abbeys and the monasteries and okay, sure, they had their abuses. That was clear. I mean, one of the only remaining contemporary bits of writing about Walsingham was written by Erasmus, who went to Walsingham a couple of times. He stayed in one of the houses down the street, and he writes about Walsingham, but he writes in a satirical manner, really sort of highlighting some of the ridiculous abuses that were going on in the church at the time. Sure, all of that happened, but the abbeys held land. They were the local farmers. They were the local hospital. They were the local school. They were the local hostelry and hotel. It's where people came and exchanged news. They were the local website, for want of a better term, and that was just wiped out, just obliterated. What must have happened to the poor at the time? That was the NHS at the time. That was the benefits office of the time.
Yeah.
What then happened to society afterwards? How it held itself together, and who had to take up the reins of looking after the poor, the needy, the sick, the uneducated. It's just, you just can't comprehend what it must have done to the heart of society. And not just that, it turned neighbour against neighbour, family against family.
But also,
again, we've got Brexit now, and we've moaned about that since 2016 about who's leave and who's remain. Think how it was in the Reformation. I don't think we've got much to complain about.
Also, as a consequence, of course, you did get one of the largest enrichments that ever occurred in early modern Europe. A lot of people did very, very well, and this is one of the reasons why, say in the Marian Counter-Reformation and things, that certain things don't go back, because a lot of people have land and that they're not giving back. So anyway,
No.
the shrine presumably goes into disuse, certainly in the early centuries of post-Reformation England. The established church is, shall we say, it's more Calvinist than perhaps it would seem to be today. Very, very little room for any kind of Marian devotion, anything like that. So did it just simply disappear off the map, as it were?
Now, this is certainly an area that I'd like to look into in more detail. Obviously, it didn't disappear from the map, and devotions were held privately, and in private chapels remained. And I know this is jumping ahead massively, but in the end, it was interesting. The Church of England, through, I suppose it's the High Anglicans, wasn't it? Through Father Alfred Hope Patton, who restored Walsingham to some kind of, it wasn't to its former glory, but some kind of glory. So even within the Anglican Church, there was still some recognition of a devotion to Our Lady. But yeah, I would like to sort of understand myself a little bit more about what happened in that period of time to keep devotion to Our Lady alive.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious. Again, there's no reason why you should know this. I'm just curious in my head. The fact that it's in Norfolk, obviously the Howards hold a lot of land in Norfolk, a lot of cousins, a lot of family around there. The Howards are the great Catholic family of England. I wonder, maybe does that help in the locale, that the maintenance of certain traditions and devotions, that maybe it wouldn't have survived in another place.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I think a lot of the local houses, and this was, the National Trust here has a lot of the local houses, and they have discovered many priest holes, for example. Mm-hmm. So in these big houses of the local nobility, some of whom may have been the Howard family or connected to the Howard family, they still maintained private chapels. Priests were hidden in the priest holes. There must have been some kind of oral tradition where these things were passed on. But it certainly, since I've been in Walsingham now, well, I've been visiting Walsingham since I was a child, but since I've been working here, it's been 7 months. And certainly that's an aspect of it that I'd like to understand more. What kept that devotion alive over all those years.
So you mentioned something, we might as well get on there. In his great book, The Stripping of the Altars, Duffy talks about the Reformation as an experience that it's as if a ditch has been thrown up across the history of the English, that there's 1,000 years of Christian history in England, which is in a sense become foreign to English Christians, because it's in a sense portrayed as being foreign. It's Roman, it's continental, it's not of them, it's not natural to them. But then in the 19th century, we have the Oxford movement, you have Pusey, the Tractarians, etc. Is that where we see? Well, I know there's this interest in this rise, the interest in the medieval in the 19th century, and maybe a recognition or an understanding that actually what had happened before wasn't foreign, but was in a sense was English, and peculiarly English in some ways. Was it in that context that we see a renewal of interest in Walsingham within the Anglican Church initially?
Again, I have to sort of profess my ignorance specifically around that time. But I think even in the Anglican Church, it was seen as suspect even at that time, because and I know we're moving sort of back to Hope Patton, who was the 1930s, but he himself faced real opposition from his own Anglican people about setting up a shrine in Walsingham. So I think, and again, you have to excuse my ignorance on this, but I think it was still seen as particularly suspect even in that time. So I'm not being very helpful to you in that respect.
I know that he was there were battles at that stage over what they called ritualism and things like that. But so if you just talk about, shall we say, the history of the return or the revival of the site as a pilgrimage site, both from the Catholic and the Anglican perspectives.
Well, yeah, around that time, and that is when we start to see, at least for us Catholics, the first step. So, yeah, if we're talking about the 19th century, it was 18. Let me check my notes. 1897.
Is it Father Wigglesworth?
A lady called Charlotte Boyd appears on the scene, who was Anglican, had discovered a chapel in a field outside of Walsingham, about a mile away, and I think she, and again, my knowledge on this is a little hazy because I can't remember who she bought it from, but I think the chapel was in the hands of the Church of England, and she bought it, and then became Catholic, and gave or donated the chapel to the Catholic Church. This has then become known as the Slipper Chapel, and people mistakenly say that's because people remove their shoes and then walk penitentially from the Slipper Chapel into Walsingham village itself, a mile down the road, down what we call the Holy Mile, and there make their devotions. Well, yes, people did remove their shoes, but remember, Walsingham was known as England's Nazareth, and therefore Walsingham itself was perceived to be holy ground, just as holy as Nazareth was. Mm-hmm. And so people would arrive at the Slipper Chapel, and I've heard that actually is Old English for slipe, or to slip into something, because you were moving from the secular ground of England outside Walsingham, mm-hmm. and slipping into the holy ground of Walsingham, and therefore you removed your shoes because it was holy ground, not that you removed your shoes because of any penitential reasons, and then the chapel was named as such. So anyway, Charlotte Boyd purchases the chapel and gives it to the Catholic Church. But this chapel had been, I think it was built in the 1200s, but it had fallen into rack and ruin, and there are photographs of it as a cow barn. You can see the farmer closing the doors behind it, and the cows sort of walking off down the lane. So she buys this. It's then extended later in the next century. A cottage is built next to it, I think, for the priest. And then that becomes the foundation of what is then now the Catholic shrine. In the meantime, the Anglicans under Hope Patton have started to build theirs back in the 30s in the village over the road from the original site of the Holy House.
So presumably it's not that it's an overnight success, or was it? I mean, it has become more and more important as a spiritual site, as a religious site, as a site of pilgrimage over the years. I mean, how I mean, in gross terms, how big is Walsingham now?
Geographically, it's still tiny. It's the village site itself, which is a high street and two pubs, a farm shop, and some very nice oldie worldy houses, one corner store, and that's the village. And then you walk the mile down the road and the Anglican shrine, of course, we can't forget that. And that takes up probably a good half of the buildings of the old village. And it's built on a triangular plot of land, and they've got buildings all the way around that triangle. And inside the triangle is their shrine. And if you were perhaps sort of ignorant of high Anglicanism, you would think it was the Catholic shrine. They have, talking of the mysteries of light, they have an altar dedicated to the mysteries of light in the middle of the shrine. You could be easily mistaken for thinking it was the Catholic shrine. So then outside the village, you have the Catholic shrine, which is, as I said, the Slipper Chapel, the cottage, what we call the Basilica, what Pope Francis has given us the right, as it were, to call a basilica. It looks like a Norfolk barn. It's built out of flint and brick. It's got a high-pitched roof. And from a distance, as you drive into Walsingham, you can look down to the valley, and it's a barn. And I think it was deliberately built like that to blend into the countryside, as they say. And typical English Catholicism, let's keep under the radar.
Yeah.
Don't want anyone to know that we're here. And if, however, people do know that we're here, and if you talk about numbers of pilgrims that come, well, frankly, if we talk about English pilgrims, it's minimal, because the English know very little about their own national Catholic shrine and its history. If we're talking about the Irish travelling community, the Polish, the Tamils, we're talking about thousands. We have 2 Tamil pilgrimages. One attracts 10 to 15,000 pilgrims, and the other is in the same year 15 to 20,000 pilgrims. And I know we're not on the scale of Knock here, but when we're talking about a tiny little shrine in the middle of nowhere,
I have to interrupt you. Why is there? How does it happen that there should be a particular Tamil devotion to Our Lady of Walsingham?
Because a cult has been built up around Our Lady of Walsingham because miracles happen, and we get the sense that many, if not half, of the Tamils that come are not Catholic. They're not even Christian. Okay. They come because they know that miracles have taken place. Children have been born, marriages have been saved, marriages have been started, maybe, and they come with great gifts. They come with flowers. They come with gold. They donate. The Catholics and the non-Catholics will stand in queues in the sun for hours simply to light a candle, and this cult has just been built up around Our Lady of Walsingham. They believe
at the moment there's the Catholic shrine, the Anglican shrine. There are, I think, 2 Orthodox churches. Is it? There's a Church of St. Seraphim in the train station.
That's right.
Train
yes.
Station, and then there's an Orthodox church in there's Little Walsingham, Greater Walsingham, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
So there's an Orthodox presence there also.
Yeah.
Is there a pilgrimage season, or is it all year round?
The season would have started on Palm Sunday with the Filipino pilgrimage, which again is another big pilgrimage, and would go on to the pro-life pilgrimage in October, with every weekend or every second weekend with some big sort of national pilgrimage. And when I say the English don't really know very much about it, there are clearly English pilgrimages, but the demographic is slightly older, possibly more tending to female. You sort of get the type who've been doing and running parish pilgrimages for years and years and years and bringing coachloads down. That demographic, well, firstly has to change because it's not sustainable, but we are seeing that it is changing, and that bit by bit families are beginning to come, just kind of dipping their toe in, testing the waters. What's this place? What can it offer us? Youth groups, individuals. This whole thing about about it being Mary's dowry, and there are sort of some what sound like fairly valid prophecies, one of which is when England returns to Walsingham, Our Lady will return to England. And I think for myself here as Director of Operations at the Shrine, one of our missions, our tasks is to we have to bring England back to Walsingham, if that is a valid prophecy. It should be top of the list on the mission statement of Walsingham.
But pilgrimage has, for some reason, become a very resonant idea for a lot of modern people. We've seen this. Well, I don't know if it's an explosion, but certainly in my own group of friends, not religious people, not historically any interest in religion, not yet interested, doing the all or part of the Il Camino. I don't know if you saw that there's Brian Sewell. There was a program which following his return to Santiago de Compostela and it was actually quite moving. I mean, Soul was an interesting, odd kind of a character, but at the end, he was moved, and for him, I think there was a sense of some kind of a resolution, of a healing, of a coming to peace with his Catholicism, uh, which was fascinating to watch. But pilgrimage generally has become something that people uh, find that it speaks to them. I wonder maybe if that's something that, while it's maybe more exotic to go to do it in Galicia and have it with wine and good seafood, but maybe is it something that could speak to people in England going? What would the traditional route be? Canterbury to Walsingham? Would that be a traditional route?
Yes, and it is funny you should say that, because the I think the Anglican Cathedral in Norwich, along with some funding, I can't remember who from, is trying to re-establish the pilgrim ways around and through Norfolk. Yeah, Canterbury certainly, but also coming down from the north of England too, and across from the west of England. So there are old pilgrimage routes that are being revitalised, and there's also I think it's called the British Pilgrimage Association, something like that. That doesn't sound quite right. But there is a sort of British pilgrimage organisation that's a secular organisation that is, again, establishing routes across the country. And funnily enough, there's been something in it about it in the press in the last couple of days, over Easter in particular. Top 10 pilgrimage sites in the United Kingdom. I think as we sort of face staycations,
Yes.
it's so what's new? What can we find that's new and different? And
Are you starting to see some new faces, different looking faces, younger faces coming in?
at the moment, it's still a little quiet, because it's only from today that the government here has eased the next stage of the lockdown. But we're kind of holding our breaths a bit about who is going to arrive, because we know that coach loads are not going to arrive. Not yet. People haven't booked coach trips, but we are wondering who's going to turn up, because Walsingham's a very popular holiday destination, and people are looking for things off the beaten track. And if you're going to go somewhere and go, oh, what's the history of this place? Oh, what's this Walsingham? We could see an influx of secular, the non-religious people coming in, tourists off the beaten track, cyclists, walkers, just dropping in. And that's going to be different. We do have accommodation, but it's been accommodation that has suited, again, coach loads of people coming down, their friends. People will book out 30 twin rooms, and Doris and Mabel will share, because they've been best friends for years and years, and they always do that when it comes to Walsingham. But it's rather like a youth hostel, and rather like the Camino. You wonder, people walk in, pitch up, knock on the door. Have you got a room? Yep, of course we have. 10 quid for a bed. It's not that. Don't quote me on it. I don't want people ringing up. We haven't put our prices out yet. They're going out this week. But you do wonder whether, as part of this whole movement, as you say, towards, or this inclination towards pilgrimage, that actually will become a renewed pilgrimage destination of a slightly different nature.
So you're saying you've been there 7 months. So could you just talk a bit about what your role is there, what you're doing, and what is being done generally at the moment in Walsingham? What are you at? What's happening?
Historically, the Catholic shrine has been led by the rector, so a priest appointed to lead the shrine for a number of years. And it's only been recently that the roles at the shrine have been quite distinctly divided between the pastoral, spiritual, liturgical, and the rector still leads that. And then the simply operational, because the rooms that we have are run like a hotel. We have a lot of buildings that we need to keep in good state of repair. We've got grounds. We've got 2 different sites, one in the village where the accommodation is, and then the shrine site a mile out in the countryside. So there's a lot of operational work. Over lockdown, we were spending hundreds on getting the drains repaired, and they haven't been repaired for a long time, and all the surface water was just, we had quite a few floods over winter. So that seems quite a sensible division of labour, really. So I can then just focus on getting those jobs done and doing 2 things, in effect: creating a pleasant place for my colleagues to work, and those are colleagues that serve the pilgrims when they come, and a pleasant place for pilgrims to come. If we go back to the Pinson Ballad and the words that Our Lady is said to have said, that everyone who comes will find succor. You want to create a place for pilgrims where they arrive and, in the best manner that one can do on earth, connect with the transcendent somehow. And that's what my job is there to do. Make sure that the place feels like a small part of heaven, a small part of Nazareth, at least.
Maybe that goes a way to answering the question I was going to ask you next. But different sites of pilgrimage have different messages or different tones or different cores. I was just curious, what is the particular message or the sensibility of Walsingham?
It's something that we talk about a lot here. People very often bring into their conversation the spirituality of Walsingham. What is it? And I think it's first and foremost a home. It was a house. A house is central to the miracle, and not just any house, but the home of Our Lady, where she was with her parents when she received the news of the incarnation, that God was coming to earth. And when we talk about this, we find it very difficult to nail it down to one specific core message. Our Lady's not recorded other than through the Pinson Ballad, really sort of saying something direct and specific, but that all that come here will find help. And where are we coming? We're coming to her house. And what was special about that house? It was where our Saviour was announced. And so, the previous rector, Monsignor Armitage, he took the strapline of "Share my joy." And for him, the message of Walsingham was a spirit of joy. And he really promoted that this is what we were doing. We were coming and sharing joy, partly because Walsingham had been seen very much the place of penitence. This whole thing about taking your shoes off and walking the Holy Mile barefoot, but also penitence for what we as English Catholics had done to our homegrown Catholicism. And I think Walsingham was then seen, and this is partly why I think it was putting people off coming. It was seen as a very penitential place. I tell you what, if you come here on a cold, wet day, it's a penitential place. The wind absolutely sears off the coast. The rain comes in horizontally.
Nobody's going to teach Irish Catholicism about penance.
Yes, you know exactly what I'm talking about in that case. Yeah.
The oldest and central. What are the most important pilgrimage sites here? St. Patrick's Purgatory in the lake, and walking up the Croagh Patrick in your bare feet.
I've done that, not in my bare feet, but oh my God, I have done that. Oof. And it was blowing a gale at the top. Snow, couldn't see.
The single great obsession of the Irish early medieval church was penance. That's what Irish Catholics do. Penance.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm very far from the first, when reading about it, to think of a similarity with this message of succor. First of all, it's very reassuring, and there's a simplicity to it. And just down the road in Norwich, of course, you have the great Julian of Norwich and her famous the refrain that all shall be well and all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. That there's a sense of commonality perhaps there in that. It's a reassurance that if you come, you will be helped. It'll be all right. All will be well and all manner of things will be well. I think that there's a beautiful simplicity and plainness to that, which I think maybe, if I was an English Catholic and that was my heritage, I think that would be a very pleasing heritage to have.
I think it is, and I think not enough of us know it yet. And it was the house too where the angel says, "Do not be afraid." And it has struck me because I started working here during lockdown, and you did sense the fear. And I think through the whole of this COVID situation, what had struck me was the fear that was generated through it was more devastating than the thing itself. Now, I'm not talking about people who were extremely ill and people who died. I'm talking about the sense of fear that was generated, I think, was more extreme than the sense of physical danger that one might have got from hearing about a pandemic. But to then come here to as you say, you know, the come and all will be well. Do not be afraid, and share my joy, and all of these sorts of things. I did find quite quickly that well, first of all, I found I had a subconscious anxiety about COVID and what was going on. And it expressed itself in things like, are there going to be food shortages? Are we going to run out of toilet roll? And I had anxieties for my family, who are back in my hometown of Bedford, and I commute to Walsingham during the week, and I was very worried.
So if somebody's watching this and they were thinking that they would be interested in going to Walsingham, so what are the practicalities that they should that they need to address, assuming we're allowed?
Assuming we're allowed. So from the 17th of May, certainly within the United Kingdom, you can travel and stay overnight in hotel type accommodation. In fact, from today, you can stay as a bubble, as a household, in self catering accommodation. The 17th of May is where we're aiming for people to come and stay. One of the practicalities is it's the arse end of the world. You've got to travel. It's a pilgrimage, I suppose one could say, but it really is the other end of the country, and the lanes get narrower and narrower the closer you get to Walsingham.
Where would the nearest your nearest airport be?
Does Norwich have an airport?
Norwich has an airport, yeah, and I think there may be flights to Norwich from Ryanair. I'm not sure.
I think you're probably looking at somewhere like Stansted,
and then a train, and then a bus, and a train.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a pilgrimage.
It is a pilgrimage. Yes, yeah, and we have a minibus, and we could pick you up from the station if you couldn't get a taxi. But the thing to do would be to go to the website, walsingham.org.uk, to ring up, to make a booking, to ask for more details about travel, transport. But you know, the doors are going to be thrown open. In fact, the shrine doors are open. People can come to the shrine. It's staying overnight that's the issue at the moment. But those doors will be thrown open soon.
I know you don't want to give business to elsewhere, but say somebody's in England and they thought, well, you know, I don't want to just fly over for 1 or 2 days in Walsingham. Let's make a bit of a thing of it. What are other pilgrimage sites that you might consider hitting whilst in the UK, in Great Britain specifically?
Yeah, I mean, depending how far you wanted to go, but you could you do far west and start at Canterbury, and follow the route up. You could go up to Lindisfarne, Holy Islands, and in fact, I'm just trying to think that I think a book has come out recently linked with these pilgrimage routes. I'd need to perhaps find the details of it and give you the details to perhaps post later. But we have, I think in June, we've got a coachload of Americans coming over who are doing a particular pilgrimage tour, and that includes Walsingham as well. So I think even if you were to come to the area, there's plenty then to see of historical, geological, geographical interest. And you're talking about, would we much rather go to Galicia and drink wine on our route? There's some fairly good seafood in the area, some good beers, local breweries, local gin distilleries.
At the end of the day, if you want to maybe finish off with a trip down to Glastonbury, down to just some good cider down there, I know, and some good seafood.
Yeah.
Go to York, go down to the Maid of York. Visit. There are lots of sites.
Yeah.
For pilgrimage sites, ancient and new in England, but the number one will, I suppose, remain Walsingham. Can you give the website address out just in case?
Yeah, walsingham.org.uk.
Walsingham.org.uk, and whatever information anybody needs, they can get on that. I'd like to thank you again, Samuel, for joining us. And I suspect we'll be talking again on other subjects, perhaps, but related. Um, Before we go, a couple of things I want to mention. That the interview that we did with Dr. Anthony Levatino, the very well-known pro-life doctor from the United States, can be found on Family Life and Protect Life pages. Again, I'd ask you to like the page here, and if you want to help us with our campaigns, we press on the donate button there. Anything you help will be used to defend the life values that we all share. So, but for tonight, again, I'd like to thank Samuel and wish him all of the best in his work in Walsingham. I've looked at some of the photographs around the place. It looks absolutely charming. It is precisely the idea that I think we all have of a pretty English village. And on a sunny day, I'm sure it's absolutely charming. And
It is
particularly
like today. It's wonderful.
on a sunny day like today, where in a free country you can sit down and drink a pint of beer, it would be perfect heaven. And on that
And we
note,
can tonight, actually. Yeah.
you can, I can't. And on that note, where there is no envy or jealousy in my heart at all, simply I rejoice in your blessing. And I'd say thank you, good night, and thank you all for joining us.